The room was silent, too silent. No whispers, no movement. Only the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan, slicing the air above a crowd holding its breath. In the front row, a mother clutched a framed photo of her son, an officer whose badge once shone under the same courthouse lights. Across from her sat the reason she'd never hear his voice again, a teenage boy in a dark suit, wrists shackled just out of view. He didn't look scared. He didn't look sorry. He looked amused. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The shuffle of feet echoed like thunder until the gavel cracked once, sharp, cold, final. And then, as silence reclaimed the courtroom, he smiled. A smirk, small, deliberate, cut across his face. Cameras clicked. Gasps rippled through the audience. The mother in the front row squeezed her son's picture tighter, whispering a prayer through shaking lips. That smirk wasn't fear. It was defiance. To him, this wasn't justice. It was theater. He'd spent years living by a different rulebook, one where power was taken, not earned, where loyalty meant silence, and silence meant safety. He believed in the code of the streets, the illusion that no law could touch him. He thought he was untouchable, but the gavel in that judge's hand was about to rewrite every rule he'd ever lived by. "Kyle Williams," the judge began, voice steady but edged with iron. "You have been found guilty of first-degree murder." The words hung in the air like smoke. The courtroom stayed frozen, every eye locked on the teen whose smirk refused to fade. He thought the world feared him. He thought his gang made him powerful. But what he didn't know was that this was the last moment he'd ever be free, inside or out. That image, the teenage killer smiling as justice closed in, would soon circle the nation. People would argue about it, study it, share it. But no one could answer the same haunting question. What makes a young man believe he can take a life and still win? This is Cold-Blooded Killers, and tonight we dive into the mind of Kyle Williams, a boy who mistook fear for respect, silence for loyalty, and found out too late that the streets never protect anyone. Before we start this story, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? Your comments keep these stories alive, and I read every single one. Before the smirk, before the courtroom, there was a neighborhood that taught him everything, except mercy. Kyle Williams grew up in the part of Lakeland, Florida, where sirens sang louder than lullabies. Streetlights flickered out before midnight, and the cracks in the pavement told stories of fights no one won. His mother worked double shifts. His father was a ghost, and the streets filled in the silence. At 12, Kyle wasn't chasing childhood dreams, he was chasing names. The older boys on the block called themselves family. They wore colors, not consciences. They told him that fear was respect, and loyalty was life. When they smiled at him, he felt seen for the first time. By 16, that feeling had turned into addiction, the rush of belonging, the power of being feared. It rewired him. He wasn't just another kid anymore. He was someone. But the code they gave him came with rules written in blood. No trust outside the crew, no tears for the weak, and never ever show fear. At school, Kyle vanished between hallways. At home, his mother prayed the late-night knocks on the door weren't for her son. But on the streets, Kyle was untouchable, or so he thought. He started with petty thefts, car radios, cell phones, wallets from unlocked trucks, small crimes that gave him fast cash and louder confidence. But when he flashed the money, older members of the gang noticed. They saw someone willing to go further, and they started pulling him deeper. Soon, Kyle wasn't stealing for survival. He was stealing for reputation. The boy who once feared being invisible now chased infamy. A former friend would later tell detectives, Kyle stopped caring who got hurt. He just wanted people to know his name. That name would eventually echo through a courtroom. Then came December 2011, a night that began like every other. Kyle and a few friends were walking through a park, trading stories, joking about the cops who cruised past too often. When a patrol car slowed beside them, the others tensed. But Kyle just laughed. "Relax," he said. "They don't mess with me." It was arrogance, pure and simple. A belief that the code, the same one that had made him feel powerful, could also make him immune. Minutes later, Officer Arnulfo Crispin stepped out of his cruiser, a young cop who believed that even troubled teens could change. He wasn't there to arrest anyone. He was there to talk. He didn't know he was walking straight into the darkness that the streets had created. That single decision, to trust instead of fear, would cost him his life. December 18th, 2011. A Sunday night so ordinary, no one knew it would soon be carved into Lakeland's memory forever. The park was quiet, the air heavy, streetlights blinked through the trees, and the faint sound of laughter carried from a nearby court where kids were playing basketball long past curfew. Officer Arnulfo Crispin cruised slowly through the area, his headlights washing over the empty playground. He'd been on shift for 6 hours already, nothing unusual. Noise complaints, a few traffic stops, a call about a stray dog, the kind of routine work that made him grateful the night was calm. He spotted 3 young men walking near the edge of the park, hoodies up, hands tucked deep into pockets. He didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He just rolled down the window and called out, "Hey fellas, you doing okay tonight?" Simple, friendly. But sometimes, fate hides inside simple things. Kyle Williams and his 2 friends stopped. One of them muttered something under his breath. Kyle looked at the badge number on the patrol car, then back at the officer. "Yeah, we good," he said, his tone low, defensive. Officer Crispin stepped out, his flashlight sweeping over the sidewalk. He wasn't looking for trouble, just making sure the park was clear before midnight. He asked their names, their ages. Then, following procedure, he decided to do a quick pat-down. That's when everything broke. In the span of a heartbeat, calm turned to chaos, and one life ended before anyone realized what had happened. When Crispin told Kyle to place his hands on the car, the boy hesitated. He glanced at his friends, a silent exchange of fear and pride. Then, like he'd done 100 times before, Kyle reached for the code that had raised him. Never let them see you weak. His hand slipped to his waistband. A flash of metal. A single gunshot ripped through the night. The echo carried across the park, a deep, hollow sound that seemed to swallow the world. Birds scattered from the trees. Somewhere a dog barked. Officer Crispin fell instantly, his flashlight rolling across the grass, the beam spinning wildly before settling on his still hand. For a moment, Kyle just stood there, gun trembling, eyes wide, chest heaving. Then pride returned, cold and false. He ran. His friends fled in opposite directions, hearts pounding. None of them looked back. Inside his cruiser, the officer's radio still crackled faintly. Dispatch tried to reach him. "Unit 432, status check. Unit 432, respond." Silence. Minutes later, the first responding officers arrived. They found Crispin lying beside his patrol car, his badge gleaming under the light of his own flashlight. He was still breathing, barely. They called for backup, for medics, for a miracle. But by the time he reached the hospital, it was already too late. A single bullet had ended a life, but it also began a manhunt that would shake an entire city. The gunshot echoed long after Kyle Williams disappeared into the night. Within minutes, flashing blue lights flooded the park. Officers sealed every exit, calling out the name of their fallen brother through static-filled radios. Helicopters tore through the sky, their searchlights sweeping over rooftops and empty yards. The city of Lakeland had changed in an instant. One of their own was down, and the killer was on the run. Every patrol unit, every detective, every reserve officer mobilized. It wasn't just a manhunt anymore. It was personal. At 1:30 a.m., a dispatcher's voice cracked over the air. All units, suspect believed to be armed and dangerous. Possible juvenile male, dark hoodie, last seen heading northbound on Memorial. Phones rang across the county. Officers who'd finished their shifts hours ago put their uniforms back on. Neighborhoods locked their doors. And somewhere under the cover of that chaos, Kyle Williams was hiding in plain sight. He slipped through backyards and alleyways, ditching his hoodie in a trash bin and wiping the gun with his sleeve. He thought he was clever. He thought he was invisible. But Lakeland PD knew these streets better than he did. By dawn, detectives had pieced together a timeline. They'd recovered shell casings. They'd spoken to the 2 teens who ran with him that night. The stories didn't line up at first, but fear has a way of loosening tongues. By the next evening, both friends had broken. One of them whispered the words that would seal Kyle's fate. It was him. He shot the cop. The streets that once protected him were now turning him in. Police tracked him to a small house on the city's west side, a friend's place. He'd been hiding there since the shooting, sleeping on a couch, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. When the SWAT team surrounded the home, they didn't kick the door down. They waited. They wanted him alive. At 6:12 p.m., a negotiator called through a bullhorn. "Kyle Williams, come out with your hands up." No response. Then, a curtain shifted. A minute later, the front door opened slowly. Kyle stepped out, hands raised halfway, chin lifted like he still had something to prove. He looked around at the guns pointed in his direction and muttered under his breath, "You all really came for me?" The officer nearest to him didn't answer. He just tightened the cuffs and said, "You're not untouchable anymore." Back at the station, the mask began to crack. In the interrogation room, Kyle slouched in his chair, arms folded, eyes fixed on the floor. The detective slid a photo across the table. It was Officer Crispin's badge, stained and scuffed from the ground where he'd fallen. Kyle looked at it for 3 seconds, maybe 4, then shrugged. "He shouldn't have searched me." That was all he said. No remorse, no fear, just deflection. But the evidence was already stacking against him. Fingerprints, shell casings, witness statements. The story he'd built on arrogance was starting to collapse. And as detectives tightened the circle, they discovered something that would end the illusion of innocence once and for all. The interrogation was over. Kyle Williams had said just enough to show defiance and not nearly enough to help himself. But detectives didn't need his confession because the evidence was already talking. From the moment he was booked, the case began to unfold like a puzzle where every piece screamed his name. The first clue came from the forensics team at the park. The bullet recovered from Officer Crispin's body was fired from a .38 caliber revolver, and when investigators found a discarded gun in a nearby drain pipe, ballistics matched it perfectly. Fingerprints? Kyle's. Residue on his hands? Positive. It was as if he had signed the weapon himself. Then came the witness statements. Both of the other teens, terrified, sleepless, and drowning in guilt, gave near identical accounts. He pulled the gun first. He said he wouldn't get caught. He laughed when it was over. Their testimonies painted a picture darker than even detectives expected. This wasn't panic, this was ego. But it was what they found on his phone that truly stripped away every layer of innocence he had left. When officers obtained a warrant and searched Kyle's cell phone, the data told its own story. Text messages sent hours after the shooting showed him bragging to a friend. "I handled it." He dropped fast. Another message followed minutes later. "They won't do nothing. They scared of me." The messages were time-stamped less than 30 minutes after Officer Crispin was shot. Even worse, he'd taken a selfie that same night, wearing the same clothes he'd fled in, smirking at the camera like he was untouchable. Investigators didn't need to guess his mindset. It was right there in his pocket. By the time the police chief reviewed the evidence, the case was already being prepared for the state attorney's office. And yet, what haunted the team wasn't just the proof of guilt. It was the complete absence of remorse. When detectives told him that the officer had died, Kyle didn't flinch. He just leaned back in his chair and said, "That's on him." One investigator later recalled, "It wasn't just what he did, it was how little it meant to him." Meanwhile, across town, the community was reeling. Lakeland wasn't the kind of city that saw this kind of violence, especially not the killing of a police officer. Vigils were held. Blue ribbons lined the streets. The department draped black cloth across their badges in mourning. At Officer Crispin's funeral, hundreds gathered. Law enforcement from across the state, community leaders, church groups, families holding candles. The sound of bagpipes filled the air as his coffin was carried past the same officers who had once called him Rookie. But back in the county jail, Kyle was laughing with other inmates. Word had already spread about his crime, and instead of shame, he basked in the attention. What he didn't realize was that his laughter, that same arrogance, would become the most damning evidence of all once the cameras started rolling. 3 years after the murder of Officer Arnulfo Crispin, the courtroom in Polk County filled to capacity. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters huddled together, notebooks ready. The air was tense enough to snap. The man who entered that room was no longer a teenager. He was 22 now, bigger, sharper around the edges, but the same smirk lingered on his face. When the bailiff called, "All rise," he didn't rush to his feet like the others. He stood slowly, eyes locked on the jury as if it were a game. A few jurors would later say they felt it, that stare, cold, detached, like he was daring them to look away first. On the other side of the room, Officer Crispin's family sat together, his mother holding the same framed photo she'd clutched the day the verdict was read for another fallen officer years ago. Only this time, it was her turn to face the unimaginable. The prosecutor rose first. His voice was steady, controlled, but each word cut like a knife. This isn't a story of panic, it's a story of power, and of a young man who believed the streets made him a god. He played the police radio recording from that night. Static crackled through the room, followed by the dispatch call that had gone unanswered. Even the reporters put their pens down. You could feel the weight of the moment settle over every shoulder. The prosecution moved through the evidence like clockwork, the ballistics, the texts, the fingerprints. Each fact hit harder than the last. And through it all, Kyle sat there, smirking, whispering to his lawyer, occasionally glancing at the gallery as if checking to see who was watching. When the state played his own cell phone recordings and messages on the courtroom screen, some jurors looked away. He was laughing in those clips, bragging, proud of what he'd done. "I told you I don't run," one of the texts read. And there it was, the real Kyle Williams, the boy who thought a gun made him invincible. But the moment that defined the trial wasn't the evidence, it was his reaction to a mother's pain. When Officer Crispin's mother took the stand to speak about her son, her voice shook but did not break. She talked about his faith, his love for his community, how he used to bring home donuts for the kids on his street after every shift. The jury was silent. Even the court reporter paused to compose herself. And then it happened, a sound so out of place it froze everyone. Laughter. Kyle Williams was laughing, softly at first, then openly chuckling as tears fell from the woman on the stand. The judge snapped, "Mr. Williams, control yourself." Kyle shrugged, still smiling. Gasps filled the courtroom. A bailiff took a step forward. The prosecutor turned toward him and said quietly, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that is the face of remorselessness." It was the moment everything changed. The smirk that had once been his armor was now the very thing sealing his fate. And as the jury watched him mock grief itself, they knew the verdict long before it was read. The laughter was gone. Hours after his outburst, the courtroom sat in eerie quiet, the weight of the evidence pressing down like gravity itself. The jurors had seen everything, the texts, the smirk, the lack of remorse. They'd heard the trembling voices of family members who would never heal, and they'd seen the boy who acted as though none of it mattered. When they left the room to deliberate, it didn't take long. 90 minutes, that's all it took to decide the rest of Kyle Williams's life. At 4:37 p.m., the doors opened again. The jury filed in, faces unreadable. Even Kyle leaned forward this time, as though the moment had finally caught up to him. The judge asked the question that hung in every corner of the room. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." He cleared his throat, unfolded the paper, and read the words that would echo through headlines the next morning. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle Williams, guilty of first-degree murder." The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was release. A mother sobbed into her hands. Officers in uniform bowed their heads. The prosecutor exhaled for the first time all day. "Kyle?" He blinked once, then he smiled, that same small, crooked smirk that had carried him through the trial. But this time, no one looked away. They watched him, and the world saw arrogance meet consequence. And when the judge spoke next, Every word felt like a hammer striking stone. Judge Neil Rodriguez leaned forward, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut. "Mr. Williams," he began, "in this courtroom I have seen anger, I have seen sorrow, I have even seen redemption, but I have never seen a man who takes pride in the pain he's caused." Kyle looked up, still defiant. "You have taken from this community an officer who represented its best, a man of faith, a servant of the people. You did not act out of fear. You acted out of arrogance." He paused, letting the silence twist in the air. "You thought you were untouchable." The room stayed still. Not a sound, not even the click of a camera. Then came the words that would define the case. "Today, the law reminds you, no one is untouchable. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down once, hard, echoing through the hall like a thunderclap. For the first time since the trial began, the smirk vanished. It didn't fade slowly. It broke, just like the illusion he'd lived by. His hands shook as the bailiffs approached. He tried to look composed, but his eyes betrayed him, wide, uncertain, human. As he was led away, the mother of Officer Crispin whispered something that reporters couldn't hear. Some said it was a prayer, others said it was forgiveness. Either way, justice had spoken. But even as the courtroom emptied, one question lingered. What becomes of a man who built his life on fear, once fear itself turns its back on him? The cell door slammed shut with a hollow clang that seemed to echo forever. For the first time in years, Kyle Williams was truly alone. No crew, no eyes watching him with respect or fear. No streets to claim as his own. Just concrete and silence. The reality of a life sentence without parole doesn't sink in all at once. It happens slowly, like rust creeping through steel. Days turn to weeks. Weeks dissolve into sameness. The noise of the world fades until only the sound of footsteps and locking gates remain. In the beginning, Kyle tried to wear his sentence like armor. He walked through the cell block with the same false pride that once ruled his life. Chin high, smirk fixed. He told anyone who would listen that he ran things on the outside, that he was respected. But prison has a way of stripping truth from lies. There are no gangs that protect you forever, no street code that earns you freedom, and no one inside those walls cares what you were before the gates closed. Within months, his reputation turned to dust. The same inmates who once whispered his name now saw through the act. They'd seen hundreds like him, boys who thought a gun made them gods only to become ghosts behind bars. He started spending more time alone. He stopped talking about the shooting, and when new inmates asked what he'd done, he said only, "I messed up." But the truth followed him. In the whispers, in the newspaper clippings that guards read during breaks, in the looks that never left his back. He wasn't feared anymore. He was forgotten. Outside those walls, the city moved on, but the officer's name never faded. Each year on December 20th, the Lakeland Police Department holds a memorial for Officer Arnulfo Crispin. A line of squad cars sits outside the station, their lights flashing blue and white in silent tribute. His colleagues speak of him as more than a victim, as a friend, a believer, a man who tried to change the world one small act at a time. In the front row, his family still sits, quieter now, but proud. They don't talk about Kyle Williams. They talk about Arnulfo, his kindness, his faith, his laughter. The officer who believed that even broken people could be fixed. Maybe that's the cruelest irony of all. The man he tried to help was the one who took his life, and the boy who believed in power learned that the only real power left was gone. Behind bars, time doesn't heal, it haunts, and Kyle Williams still wakes up every morning to the sound of the same cell door closing. The years passed, but in Lakeland some names never faded. Every December, blue lights illuminate the streets near the police department, a sea of color glowing against the winter dark. Officers stand shoulder to shoulder in silence, their heads bowed, badges draped with black cloth. At the center of it all, a single photograph rests beneath the memorial plaque. Officer Arnulfo Crispin, smiling young, full of life. He was the kind of man who didn't just wear a badge, he lived it. He believed in second chances. He believed people could change. and that belief cost him everything. For his family, the loss never truly healed. His mother once said in an interview, "I forgive him, but I will never forget." Her words became the heartbeat of the city, forgiveness not as weakness, but as strength. Because forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it proves it didn't win. Meanwhile, inside a grey concrete cell miles away, Kyle Williams faded into obscurity. No more headlines, no more cameras. The world that once knew his name had moved on without him. Inmates who once whispered about his case stopped caring. The new generation inside didn't even recognize him. The same street code that had promised loyalty was nowhere to be found. Some nights he'd sit at the edge of his bunk staring at the wall, the same 4 feet of paint he'd see for the rest of his life. No sound except the low hum of the fluorescent light above. Maybe he thought about the streets. Maybe he thought about that smirk. Maybe he didn't think at all, because for men like him, time isn't a punishment. It's an echo. Every hour reminds him of the second that changed everything. And in the echo of that single gunshot, 2 stories remain, one of arrogance and one of honor. Arnulfo Crispin's name became part of the Lakeland Police Memorial, engraved alongside other fallen officers, a reminder of courage and sacrifice. His story is taught to new recruits, not as a cautionary tale but as a promise that compassion isn't weakness and justice never forgets. Every year, when the bagpipes play and his badge number is called, the silence that follows feels sacred. Because in that silence, the city remembers what was lost and what was learned. Kyle Williams' name, however, lives only in the archives of the court system, filed away, forgotten. His legacy is one of warning, proof that pride is temporary but consequence is forever. If this story moved you, if you believe justice was served, type "justice delivered" in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Cold-Blooded Killers, where we uncover the stories that remind us that evil has a face and justice has a voice. The story of Kyle Williams isn't about one gunshot. It's about every choice that led to it. A boy who mistook fear for respect, a community that believed compassion could reach even the unreachable, and a courtroom where arrogance finally met consequence. In the end, justice didn't roar. It whispered, through the gavel's echo, through a mother's quiet tears, through the fading smirk of a man who once thought the law couldn't touch him. Officer Arnulfo Crispin's name lives on, etched in stone, remembered in prayers, carried in the hearts of those he served. Kyle Williams's name lives too, in the pages of court transcripts locked inside a system he once mocked. 2 paths, 1 moment, and a lesson carved in silence. The streets don't protect you, they bury you. This was Cold-Blooded Killers, where every case reminds us that behind the headlines are the people who paid the price for someone else's choices. So if this story left a mark on you, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Your voice keeps these stories alive. Until next time, stay aware, stay human, and remember, even in the darkest corners of crime, justice still finds the light.